All right, so ready to dive into today's news. We've got a lot to cover. We're talking market highs, economic puzzles, big company moves, and even a parrot dentist.
Hmm.
Yeah, you heard that right.
Uh,
We're sifting through it all, getting to the good stuff so you can start your day feeling informed and, well, maybe even a little bit smarter.
it's all about making sense of it all, seeing how these seemingly random events are actually connected.
Exactly. So let's jump right in with the markets. The U.S. stock indexes are hitting record highs. Dow, S&P 500, NASDAQ, they're all up there. Tech stocks are going crazy, especially Salesforce, up 11%. And Marvell, get this, up a whopping 23%. It feels like all this AI hype is fueling a lot of this.
Yeah, AI is definitely a major factor. The performance of indexes like the NASDAQ 100, which tracks, the biggest non-financial companies on the NASDAQ and what they call the Magnificent Seven, those are the huge tech giants. They're all pointing to this AI optimism. Investors are betting big on AI, hoping it'll revolutionize industries.
But it's interesting, though, because while the U.S. market is celebrating, things are a bit more, I guess, mixed in Asia and Europe. So why is there this kind of split in the global markets? What's going on there?
Well, you can think of it like different planets with different gravitational pulls. Interest rates are a big factor. The U.S. Federal Reserve has been easing up on those rates to boost the economy. But over in Europe, central banks are being more cautious, kind of tapping the brakes a bit. And that difference in policy, how they're managing money, it really influences where investors put their money and how it flows around the world.
And I know currency plays a role too, right? The euro and the British pound, they're both down against the dollar. That's got to have an impact on investors who are, working across borders.
Absolutely. Currency fluctuations, they can make things really unpredictable. And then you throw in the volatility of commodity prices. Oil prices have been all over the place lately, making everyone nervous. While gold is holding steady, as that traditional safe haven asset. But these price swings, they can create a ripple effect across the board.
It's like a giant game of Jenga. One wrong move and everything could come crashing down.
Hmm.
But before we move on from markets, I'm curious, what industries or companies are why you, our listeners, keeping an eye on? Are you riding the AI wave or maybe feeling a little cautious about all this market exuberance? Let us know.
Yeah, it's a great question to consider. Thinking about how these global trends are affecting your own financial landscape, it helps bring things down to earth.
Okay, speaking of bringing things down to earth, let's talk about the economy. And the signals, well, they're kind of mixed. We've got Fed Chair Jerome Powell saying the U.S. economy is looking good, but then we've got other Fed officials like Musalem suggesting maybe it's time to, slow down those interest rate cuts. What's the deal with these mixed messages?
Well, you got to remember the Fed uses interest rates to kind of fine tune the economy, right? It's like a volume knob. They're trying to find that perfect balance between encouraging growth and keeping inflation under control. Too much stimulus and prices could go through the roof. Too little and the economy might stall. It's a tricky balancing act, and so it makes sense there'd be some disagreements within the Fed about what to do next.
Are we head for an economic slowdown or are we on the right track? It's hard to tell with all these conflicting signals.
Yeah, it really is. And over in Europe, the mood is a bit more cautious. Christine Lagarde, the ECB president, she says that the fight against inflation is almost over, but not quite. And the Bundesbank president, he's been sending out some warning signals about Germany's economic outlook. So it seems like, yeah, this global recovery is facing some bumps in the road.
And even here in the U.S., the data is all over the place. The Fed's Beige Book says that economic activity and business optimism are up, and the Bank of America CEO is seeing strong consumer spending. But then you have the ISM Services Index, which had a bigger drop than expected, and businesses are blaming uncertainties around trade policies and, of course, the election. What do you make of all this? It's a lot to digest.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity for the Fed. They have to look at the big picture, consider all these factors before making any moves. And those decisions, well, they can have huge consequences, not just here, but for the global economy.
So those PMIs we hear about, the Purchasing Managers Indexes, what are they telling us? What are they all about?
Okay, so PMIs are like a temperature check for the manufacturing and service sectors. They give us a snapshot of how businesses are feeling about things like new orders, production, and hiring. Think of it like a doctor checking your pulse to get a sense of your overall health. And right now, those PMIs suggest that growth is slowing down in both the UK and the Eurozone.
Okay, so it sounds like the global economy is kind of at a crossroads. There were some bright spots, especially here in the U.S., but there are also some definite warning signs. It makes the Fed's job even more crucial because their decisions impact everyone. It's got to be affecting our listeners somehow. How are these trends playing out in your lives? Think about that for a moment.
Yeah, think about it. Are you feeling that pinch of inflation? Are you changing your spending habits or your investment strategy? Or are you feeling optimistic about the future? These economic indicators, they're not just abstract numbers, they represent real forces that are shaping our lives.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's zoom in on some companies that are making headlines. First up, we've got this battle going on in the weight loss drug market. Eli Lilly's Mounjaro just had a big win against Novo Nordisk's Wegovy in a head-to-head trial. People taking Mounjaro lost an average of 20% of their body weight, while those on Wegovy lost 14%. That's a big difference.
It is, and it makes you wonder, could this be a turning point in the fight against obesity? What could the impact be on the healthcare industry, on insurance companies, on society in general? It has the potential to change so many lives. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
It reminds us that innovation can come from anywhere. And speaking of unexpected things, did you hear about that boy in China who used his pet parrot to pull out a loose tooth?
Wait, are you serious?
Yeah. Apparently, this kid's parrot is a budding dentist. It's incredible. It's a good reminder that even with all the serious stuff happening in the world, there's still room for a little bit of, ingenuity, a little bit of humor.
Definitely puts things in perspective.
For sure. Okay, let's get back to some more serious news from around the world. Things are getting a bit tense over in France. The parliament just ousted their prime minister because of his proposed budget cuts.
It's a big political shakeup. It shows how tough it is for governments to balance budgets while still providing essential services. And France is a great example of how those tensions can play out. It'll be interesting to see how this impacts France's role in the European Union and on the world stage.
And across the pond, here in the U.S., we've got some political intrigue brewing. Word is President Trump is thinking about replacing his Pentagon nominee, Pete Hegseth, with, get this, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
Wow, that would definitely add fuel to the fire. DeSantis is a rising star in the Republican Party and a very close ally of Trump. If he gets nominated, it would have a huge impact on U.S. defense policy, military strategy, and the whole power dynamic within the administration.
It's a lot to process. Record-breaking markets, economic question marks, companies adapting to a rapidly changing world, and political drama on both sides of the Atlantic. It's enough to make your head spin.
It's definitely a lot to absorb, but it's also fascinating. The world's always in motion, and all these events are connected in ways we don't always see right away. It's like a giant tapestry where every thread contributes to the overall picture.
Exactly. So before we move on, let's highlight a few key takeaways. The stock market is on fire, hitting new highs. But there are some signs out there, some hints that a correction might be coming.
And while the U.S. economy looks pretty good, the global economic outlook is a bit more unclear. There are mixed signals, and central banks are facing some tough choices about what to do next.
And the business world. It's a whirlwind of activity, with companies tackling everything from, weight loss drug competition to the challenges of operating in a globalized economy.
And let's not forget the political landscape, with tensions running high both at home and abroad.
So here's the big question. With all this uncertainty in the world, what can you do to stay informed and make smart decisions in your personal life and professionally?
It's something we should all be asking ourselves. How can we filter out the noise and find reliable information? How can we learn to think critically, to assess different viewpoints and make good decisions?
It's about more than just taking in information, right? It's about understanding it, analyzing it, and applying it to your own life.
And maybe the most important thing is knowing that there's always more to learn.
Absolutely. The world's always changing, and we need to change with it. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep engaging with the world.
And hey, you never know. You might even discover a hidden talent for parrot dentistry along the way.
You never know. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the news. We'll be back soon with more insights to help you navigate this constantly changing world. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
Yeah, it really is amazing how, all these stories, markets, parrots, it just shows how much the world's changing every day. Opportunities and risks everywhere. Feels like we're all just trying to figure out how to deal with uncertainty these days.
It's like solving a puzzle where the pieces keep moving. But that's kind of what makes it interesting, right? So let's shift gears a bit and focus on some specific companies that are in the news. We've got this, battle of the titans going on in the weight loss drug market. Eli Lilly's Mounjaro, remember that one? It just blew Novo Nordisk's Wegovy out of the water in a head-to-head trial. People using Mounjaro lost, on average, get this, 20% of their body weight. And those on Wegovy, only 14%. That's a massive difference.
It really is. It makes you think, could this be like the breakthrough we've been waiting for in the fight against obesity? What's it going to mean for healthcare insurance companies? Even for like societal attitudes toward weight? We're talking about potentially changing millions of lives. It's huge.
It's like we're seeing a whole new era of healthcare emerging. But not all the company news is so uplifting. There's been a real tragedy at UnitedHealth. Brian Thompson, the CEO of their insurance division, were shot and killed in New York City.
It's just awful, such a shock. And it makes you worried about the safety of, people in those high-profile healthcare positions, especially with everything going on these days. And it also makes you wonder about the impact this will have on UnitedHealth, a company that plays such a massive role in U.S. healthcare.
It's a stark reminder that things can change in an instant, even in the corporate world. Let's look across the globe now, to China. General Motors is having some real trouble over there. They just announced charges of over $5 billion related to their operations in China. What's going on with GM in China? What's the story?
It's a tough market for foreign companies right now. There's trade tension, the economy's slowing down, and they're facing really tough competition from Chinese automakers who are upping their game. GM struggles are a prime example of just how hard it is for U.S. companies to succeed in this increasingly complex global landscape.
It's a reminder that globalization isn't always easy. It's a two-way street, and sometimes the road gets rough. And speaking of rough roads, Intel, the big chip maker, is sending signals that they're being cautious about the future. They're keeping their financial forecast the same, but they're also holding back on spending. What do you think's behind this careful approach?
I think Intel's being smart. The global economy is sending mixed signals, and who knows, maybe there's a market correction around the corner. Plus, they need to invest a lot in new technologies like AI to stay competitive. It's a balancing act, staying ahead of the curve while also managing risk.
It makes you wonder, is this tech boom we've been riding really sustainable in the long term? So many factors are at play. Oh, before I forget, there are a couple of other interesting company moves. Amundi, the French asset management company, they're thinking about buying Alliance Global Investors. And then there's NXP Semiconductors. They're teaming up with a company affiliated with TSMC to boost their chip production. What's the significance of all that?
These moves really show the dynamics of, the global business world. Companies are always looking for ways to grow, to adapt, stay one step ahead. Amundi's potential acquisition, well, that's a classic example of consolidation. Bigger players swallowing up smaller ones to gain market share and expand. And NXP's partnership, that shows how important collaboration is in tech, especially for something as vital as chips.
It's a reminder that even when things are uncertain, there's always opportunity for those who are willing to take risks and be strategic. So before we wrap up this company spotlight, I'd love to hear from you, our listeners. Have any of these company developments affected you personally? Maybe you've seen changes in your investments or your healthcare options or the technology you use. We always love hearing how these global business trends impact your everyday lives.
It is fascinating to see how these corporate decisions that seem so distant actually end up shaping our daily lives. It shows how connected the global economy is and how our individual choices can ripple out and affect everything.
All right, time for a little break from the boardrooms and all this serious business stuff. Remember that story about the parrot dentist?
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
It's a real story. A boy in China used his pet parrot to pull out a loose tooth. Crazy, huh?
It's amazing what people and apparently parrots can do when they put their minds to it. It's a good reminder that amidst all the serious news, there's still room for some creativity, a little ingenuity, and some laughs.
It's like thinking outside the box, literally.
Yeah.
But let's turn our attention back to the international scene. Things have been getting pretty heated in France. Their parliament just kicked out their prime minister over some proposed budget cuts.
Yeah, France has had its share of economic challenges lately, and the government's been trying to implement austerity measures to get things back on track. But these budget cuts, not popular, and it looks like the prime minister ended up taking the fall for pushing them too hard. It's a reminder that even in democracies, leaders are accountable to the people, and economic policies can have big political consequences.
It's a case of, I guess, no pain, no gain. But it seems like the people in France weren't willing to accept the pain part. And speaking of political dramas, there's some intrigue brewing in the U.S. Rumor has it that President Trump is considering replacing his Pentagon nominee, Pete Hegseth, with, wait for it, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Why the potential shakeup? What's your take?
Well, Hegseth's nomination has been pretty controversial. Questions about his qualifications, some of his past comments. It seems like Trump might be looking for a a less risky choice. And DeSantis definitely fits the bill. He's a rising star in the Republican Party, a big supporter of Trump, and he's done well in Florida. If he gets nominated, it would definitely stir things up in Washington.
Always something happening in politics, right? New twists and turns all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered a ton today, from record high markets to economic uncertainties, company shakeups, parrot dentists, you name it. It's been quite a tour of current events from France to the U.S. and everywhere in between.
It has been, but that's what makes it so engaging, exploring the world, understanding what's happening, and, sometimes finding moments of humor and wonder along the way.
So before we move on, let's recap some of the key takeaways for our listeners. The stock market's soaring to new heights, but there are those warning signs, those hints of a possible correction looming.
And while the U.S. economy seems strong, the global picture is a bit more, complicated. We're seeing those slowdowns in Europe and China, and those could definitely impact us here at home eventually.
Plus, those central banks are trying to find that sweet spot, stimulating growth without letting inflation run wild. It's a tough job, and there's no guarantee they'll get it right.
And the business world.
Hmm?
It's a nonstop whirlwind of activity, with the companies facing all sorts of challenges, from weight loss drug competition to figuring out how to operate in a globalized economy.
And let's not forget the political landscape, always a source of tension, both domestically and internationally.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. Events in one part of the world can have ripple effects that reach everywhere.
It's like a giant web, and we're all connected. So here's a question for you to ponder. With all this uncertainty in the world, what can you do to stay informed and make smart decisions in both your personal and professional life? It's something we should all be thinking about.
How can we cut through the noise and find reliable information? How can we learn to think critically and assess all these different viewpoints? It's about more than just passively absorbing information. It's about engaging with it, analyzing it, and applying it to your own life.
Absolutely. It's like becoming a detective, right?
Mhm.
You gather evidence, you weigh the facts, and then you draw your own conclusions.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to change your mind as you learn more. The world's always evolving, and our understanding should evolve with it.
It's all about being open to new information and adapting to change.
And I think maybe the most important thing is to be patient with yourself. Staying informed is a lifelong journey, not a destination. We're all constantly learning and growing.
Very well said. So remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop learning. The world is full of surprises, and that's what makes it so exciting. Feels like we're living in some pretty wild times, huh? So much change, so much uncertainty.
It is, but it's also, it's what keeps things interesting.
Right. Always something new happening.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up today, let's think about some key takeaways, things you can actually use to, to make sense of it all.
I think one thing to remember is that the stock market, even though it's doing so well, hitting those record highs, it's not always a true reflection of the whole economy.
Yeah. It's driven by a lot of things like investor sentiment, and that can change so quickly.
Exactly. So while the U.S. economy looks strong, things globally are a bit more complicated. We've got those slowdowns in Europe and China, and those could eventually have an impact here. It's all connected.
Plus, you've got the central banks, trying to find that balance, trying to keep inflation under control while also stimulating growth. It's a tough job, and no guarantees they'll get it right.
And then there's the business world. Companies are constantly having to adapt. New technologies, changing consumer demand, geopolitical risks. It's a lot. The companies that can adapt, the ones that can innovate, those are the ones that will succeed.
It's like a never-ending game of chess. You got to be thinking several moves ahead. And of course, there's politics. Always a source of, intrigue and sometimes a bit of anxiety, too.
Yeah. From those budget battles in France to potential changes in the U.S. cabinet, it's clear that politics really shapes things, both here and around the world.
So with all that going on, with all this uncertainty, what can we do as individuals to stay informed, to make good decisions, both in our personal lives and professionally?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think, first of all, it's important to be aware of our own biases. We all have them, and they can cloud our judgment.
Yeah. It's so important to challenge our own assumptions, to try to see things from different perspectives.
And we can't just sit back and passively consume information. We have to be active participants. Question what we read, what we hear, dig deeper, try to make those connections.
It's like being a detective, right? Gather the evidence, weigh the facts, and then come to your own conclusions.
Exactly. And it's okay to change your mind as you learn more. Things are always changing, and so should our understanding of the world.
Being open to new information, being willing to adapt, that's so important.
And maybe the most important thing is to be patient with yourself. Staying informed, it's a journey, not a destination. It's a process of lifelong learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, as we wrap up today's deep dive, remember to stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop learning. The world's full of surprises, and that's part of what makes it so interesting. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon with more insights to help you navigate this ever-changing world. Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those minds sharp.